Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the week ending the 13th of May 1923, someone throws an egg, someone else pushes a pram and gets into trouble for it, Churchill is a brilliant failure, Austrians live with hyperinflation, the Irish have border trouble, and modern education is rubbish. But first, the headlines. In the 18th of March episode, I mentioned that the British government had rounded up about 1,000 Irishmen suspected of being involved in the irregular side in the Irish Civil War. The first thing is, it wasn't actually 1,000, it was about 100. But this test case has gone to court, and the courts have decided that this is illegal, and they have demanded these people be released, which is slightly difficult because, of course, these people were deported to another jurisdiction. So we'll see what happens on that one. The British government has issued a note to the Soviet government. This is complaining about a number of issues, harassment of British trawlers operating near Russia, harassment of British citizens in Russia, the war on religion, and various attempts to interfere or encourage rebellion in parts of the British Empire. And in Lausanne, where the talks are taking place to come to a treaty in regards to the future of Turkey, the Soviet representative has been assassinated. In other news, on Wednesday, the Times published an article outlining the very large number of what were known as excursion trains. Now, what's happening is that there is a bank holiday coming up, the Whitsun bank holiday, and what happened is, obviously, people want to go on holiday over a bank holiday, and train companies have a tradition of organising trains to popular holiday destinations at a cut price rate. On Tuesday the 8th, there was a story about a case before the courts involving the maximum wage. Now, what this was that in football there was a maximum wage. There was a maximum wage that you could, as a club, could pay your players. This had been introduced, I believe, in the 1900s because the clubs didn't want to pay what they regarded as exorbitant wage bills. So now the story is, or the case involves a footballer. He made a contract with his club, Chesterfield as it happens, at £9 a week. But since he made this in, I think it was 1921, but because Britain is undergoing deflation at the moment, the club said, well, or the FA actually, it was the Football Association, said, actually reduce the maximum wage to below £9 a week. It's now £8 a week. So the club said, well, we only have to pay you 8 shillings now. And the footballer said, no, you don't. You had to pay full whack. Anyway, as it happens, he seems to be winning that case at the moment. But it is certainly interesting that he's playing for Chesterfield. Chesterfield are not a big club now, and they weren't then. They were playing in the 3rd Division North, which, as the name implies, is actually the third tier of football. In fact, they have 3rd Division North and 3rd Division South, so usually you can say it's a third and a half. So, which implies that the maximum wage is really pretty low. And finally, there's a special screening of the German movie Dr. Mabuse, all 4 hours of it. I had thought that throwing eggs at politicians was a relatively modern phenomenon, but apparently not. This is from Tuesday the 8th of May. At Menai Bridge yesterday, Hugh Williams Jones of Bryn Siensin, I hope I haven't murdered that too badly, was fined 7 shillings 6 for throwing an egg at the car in which Sir Robert and Lady Thomas were riding on the Anglesey election polling day. When I read that, I couldn't help but be reminded of that incident, I think it was actually 2001, where someone threw an egg at the Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott and hit him, and then Prescott responded and hit him. That was also in North Wales. Maybe there's something in the rarebit. Sometimes you encounter an article that really throws you. This is an example. This is from Wednesday the 9th of May. At Brighton yesterday, Albert Edwards of Lincroft Street, Manchester, and his wife, Ida May Edwards, appeared in custody on a warrant on charges arising out of the recent Perambulator Race from London to Brighton. Mrs. Edwards was charged with wilfully ill-treating, neglecting and exposing a male child, aged 4 months, in a manner likely to cause unnecessary suffering and injury to health on April the 7th, and her husband was charged with aiding and abetting his wife, and causing or procuring the commission of the offence. A perambulator race, a pram race, from London to Brighton. I mean, we're talking about people, running with their prams, and it would appear their infants, from London to Brighton. That really is quite a long way. I understand it's about 50 miles. Surely not. Well, actually, it turns out, yes, that's exactly what they were doing. Well, walking rather than running. We are very lucky that someone out there has researched this and put it out on the internet, and I will put up a link to it. And yes, there were 5 competitors. They all had a pram. They all had their last born, and they walked to Brighton. Well done, you'd have thought. As far as this case goes, it'll be interesting to see what happens, because it doesn't seem to me to be any different from just walking your child. So we'll see. Although you would have to say, I would point out that I don't think this race has ever been repeated. Last week, Winston Churchill criticised socialism. This week, the former leader of the Labour Party, J.R. Kleins, a man who's largely been lost to history, responded. This is from Monday the 7th. There would never be any danger, he said, from Labour, but rather from Tory reactionaries who resisted any tendency to necessary and beneficent economic and industrial changes. Mr. Churchill had come out to utter another solemn warning. Mr. Churchill was our most brilliant failure. If fine words and high-sounding phrases could secure social development, Mr. Churchill would long since have solved every problem, and Labour would not have had a single grievance left. The greatest danger to this country was that Mr. Churchill would ever get back to any office with power to work greater mischief than he had previously done. Not a single beneficent social measure could be credited to Mr. Churchill. Well, given that Winston Churchill, spoiler alert, will soon become Chancellor of the Exchequer, take Britain back onto the gold standard at a very high rate, which will prove almost impossible to sustain, he's kind of got a point. On the question of there not being a single beneficent social measure that could be credited to Mr. Churchill, well, it hasn't really been his job. Since entering the cabinet in 1908, Churchill has been President of the Board of Trade, Home Secretary, First Lord of the Admiralty, Munitions Minister and Colonial Secretary, none of which I would associate with social measures. Having established that there will be a border in Ireland, there now comes the hard part of deciding where it ought to be. This is from Tuesday the 8th. Interest in the much-vexed boundary question has been revived by a leading article in the Belfast Irish News, the organ of Ulster nationalism. The Irish News boldly advocates the dropping of the Boundary Commission altogether, and the substitution of a more reasonable policy. For 2 reasons, it says. The Boundary Commission is a broken reed. In the first place, it never will materialise on account of the resolute antagonism of the Northern Government, and in the second place, even if by some chance it should come into being, the fact that its chairman would almost certainly be an English Tory would load the dice against nationalist interest. The Irish News represents the large majority of Roman Catholics in Northern Ireland, and for months it has been expressing dissatisfaction at the policy of the Free State government in its dealing with the North, and has criticised quite openly the abstentions of the 12 Nationalist and Sinn Féin members from the Belfast Parliament. The Northern Nationalists who must live in the 6 counties recognise that their only feasible policy is a policy of conciliation and common sense. Something tells me that may not last. A fortnight ago I complained that the Times had never really described what it was like living with hyperinflation. Last week they did have a few words to say on the subject, but this week they have outdone themselves. Admittedly, this article concerns Austria, not Germany, but there is no reason to suppose that things are substantially different there. Soup kitchens for brain workers. In Vienna, prices, of course, are fantastic. Every taxicab has a card with 7,000x fare number 2. Other prices are also from 10,000 to 15,000 times the normal. I bought, for instance, a block of writing paper, the cost of which worked out to 150 kronen a sheet. Obviously, kronen was the currency then, not the shilling. £6 at pre-war rates, but worth only half a farthing now. No wonder that treasury notes of under 100 kronen are no longer in use. They are literally worth less than the paper they are printed on. To save labour in writing, it has become the custom to leave out the last 3 noughts on pricing bills, etc. All this did not surprise me, knowing the state of the exchange, but what did was the absence of any appearance of want in Vienna, of shabbiness, destitution, or hunger. Streets all full and throbbing with life. No omnibuses, but a magnificent tram service. I can vouch for that. Public transport in Vienna is marvellous. Anyway, it goes on, carrying crowds of people in all directions. Though outwardly Vienna wears a normal aspect and looks as it did 10 years ago, by probing below the surface much hardship and distress will be found. This is especially the case with some brain workers of the middle classes, who are no man's children, such as teachers, professors, students, musicians, sculptors, and certain old army officers, as also with those who are dependent on a little capital, painfully accumulated in the past, and are now unable to earn a living. Rents also have been regulated, but for vote-catching purposes on an absurdly low scale, so that the cost of housing forms an inappreciable item in the living expenses of an average family. Landlords are hard hit. Rents not only fail to produce interest on capital, but are not sufficient to cover the cost of repairs and maintenance, so that houses are deteriorating. Please take note, Sadiq Khan. In such circumstances it does not pay to build or to buy houses. Many owners who used to live handsomely on their rents are now reduced to poverty and have to live on charity, or have to be supported on the rates, while yet owning good and substantial houses. Also hard hit are those who had invested their all in government securities or in war loans. Families in Switzerland, Holland, Sweden, and other countries have taken destitute Austrian children and have adopted some permanently. The great number of antiquaries that have opened shops throughout Vienna show that many household treasures are being sold. In this day and age, people often complain about the dumbing down of education and question whether a university degree is really all that useful. 1923 was no different. This is from a G.B. Grundy, who appears to be an Oxford academic. Just after the war, there came to Oxford a number of men who had served in the army. In more than 30 years' experience of teaching in Oxford, I do not remember any generation of undergraduates which proved itself more earnest and more able in its work. But that generation has passed away, and now Oxford is getting the products of the new ideas in education as practised in the public schools. Compulsory Greek has been abolished in order that more time may be given to modern languages. Judged by results, and we see them in Oxford on a large and comprehensive scale, the average public schoolboy is, as far as languages are concerned, learning little or nothing at all. Hardly any offer Greek. In Latin, examiners are hard put to it to find pieces of prose and unseen, he means unseen translations, such as will make it possible to pass a fair percentage of candidates without a positive outrage to decency. Many cannot write a single sentence of French correctly. Do I believe that? Anyway, he goes on. One wonders what these unfortunate lads are going to do for a living after they leave the university. And one wonders too what the parents are going to do when they come to realise the returns on the heavy expenditure on their boys' education. They will realise this soon, for these sons of theirs, these products of post-war ideas in education. By the way, I'd love to know what these ideas are, but he doesn't say. Anyway, he goes on. Well, other than the bit about modern languages. Anyway, he goes on. Will soon be coming back on their hands, and then they will have to solve the question of getting employment for those whose ignorance renders them unemployable in the professions and in many forms of business. Maybe there'll be a war. Anyway, that's all for this week. I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.